The scorching heat of the Nevada desert seemed mild compared to the fire that ignited the moment Isabella Rosewood stepped into the Silver Dollar Saloon. Her crimson dress hugged every curve as she moved through the smoky interior, drawing the attention of every man in the establishment. But it was the lone cowboy in the corner, nursing his whiskey with the intensity of a man carrying secrets, who made her pulse quicken in ways she hadn't felt in years. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into this passionate tale of the Wild West, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and knowing where our amazing audience is located always brings a smile to my face. Jake Morrison had seen plenty of beautiful women pass through Dusty Ridge, but none had ever made him forget his own name with just a glance. The mysterious brunette with eyes like molten chocolate was trouble wrapped in silk and lace, and every instinct he'd honed during his years as a gunslinger told him to stay away. Yet when she approached his table with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, he found himself powerless to resist. "Mind if I sit?" Isabella's voice was honey and smoke, sweet enough to draw him in and rough enough to promise danger. Without waiting for an answer, she slid into the chair across from him, her fingers trailing along the scarred wooden table. "You look like a man who's seen his share of trouble." Jake's steel-gray eyes met hers, and he felt something shift inside his chest, like a lock finally finding its key. "Trouble seems to follow me wherever I go, ma'am. Name's Jake Morrison." He tipped his worn black hat slightly, never breaking eye contact. "And you are?" "Isabella Rosewood," she replied, her lips curving into a smile that promised both salvation and damnation. "And I have a feeling that trouble you mentioned is about to get a whole lot more interesting." The chemistry between them was immediate and undeniable, crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Jake had built walls around his heart after losing everything he'd ever cared about in the war. But this woman seemed to see right through every defense he'd carefully constructed. Isabella, for her part, had come to Dusty Ridge with a mission that had nothing to do with falling for a rugged cowboy with haunted eyes and hands that looked like they could be equally gentle or deadly. "What brings a lady like you to a place like this?" Jake asked, signaling the bartender for another round. The saloon was filled with the usual crowd of miners, drifters, and cowboys, but it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Isabella's fingers wrapped around her glass, and Jake couldn't help but notice how delicate they looked, even as something in her posture suggested she was anything but fragile. "Let's just say I'm looking for someone who owes me something very valuable," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made Jake lean closer. "And I have reason to believe he might be in this town." The scent of her perfume mixed with the smoky air of the saloon, creating an intoxicating combination that made Jake's head spin. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone with such intensity. "Sounds like you might need some help with that," he offered, surprised by his own words. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's problems, but something about Isabella made him want to be her protector. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison," Isabella said, her hand briefly touching his across the table. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm. "But this is something I need to handle myself. Some fires burn too hot for anyone else to get close." Jake's eyes darkened at her words, and he leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the flickering lamplight. "Maybe that's exactly why you need someone who's not afraid of getting burned," he said quietly. "I've walked through hell more times than I can count, Miss Rosewood. A little heat doesn't scare me." The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Isabella found herself fighting the urge to reach across the table and trace the scar that ran along Jake's jawline. She'd come to Dusty Ridge with a clear purpose, but this cowboy was making her question everything she thought she knew about herself. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the piano music drifting from the corner of the saloon. "Then why don't you tell me?" Jake challenged, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What's got you running scared, Isabella? Because that's what you're doing, isn't it? Running from something or someone?" Isabella's breath caught in her throat at the accuracy of his observation. She was indeed running, but not in the way he might think. She was running towards something dangerous, something that could destroy everything she'd worked for. "Some secrets are too dangerous to share," she said finally, her eyes never leaving his face. Jake reached across the table and gently took her hand in his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her soft skin. "I've got plenty of secrets of my own, darlin'. Maybe it's time we both stopped carrying them alone." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Isabella could feel her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the intensity of Jake's gaze. She'd spent years learning to trust no one, to rely only on herself, but something about this man made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the world alone. "Your lips are too hot," she whispered, her eyes dropping to his mouth before she could stop herself. The words slipped out before she could think better of them, revealing more than she'd intended about the effect he was having on her. Jake's smile was slow and dangerous, like a wolf who'd just caught the scent of his prey. He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her ear when he spoke. "Then let's see how long before they burn us both," he whispered, his voice sending shivers down her spine despite the heat of the desert night. The promise in his words hung between them like a challenge, and Isabella knew that whatever happened next would change everything. She'd come to Dusty Ridge looking for one thing, but she was beginning to realize she might find something entirely different. Something that could either save her or destroy her completely. As the night wore on, they talked and drank, sharing stories and stolen glances that spoke of desires neither was quite ready to voice. Jake told her about his ranch on the outskirts of town, about the horses he trained and the quiet life he'd built for himself after years of violence and loss. Isabella spoke carefully about her past, revealing just enough to keep him interested while hiding the dangerous truth that had brought her to his town. "I should go," Isabella said finally, as the saloon began to empty and the hour grew late. But even as she spoke the words, she made no move to leave, her hand still resting in Jake's larger one. "Should and want are two different things," Jake observed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Which one are you listening to right now?" Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked into his eyes, seeing her own desire reflected back at her. "The smart thing would be to walk away," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been accused of being particularly smart," Jake said with a grin that made her stomach flip. "Especially when it comes to beautiful women with secrets." The walk to Jake's ranch was filled with a tension so thick it was almost tangible. They rode side by side through the moonlit desert, the only sounds the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves and the distant call of coyotes. Isabella kept stealing glances at Jake's profile, illuminated by the silver light of the full moon, and wondered what she was doing. This wasn't part of the plan. Getting involved with anyone, especially someone like Jake Morrison, was a complication she couldn't afford. But as they reached his ranch and he helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary, Isabella found herself caring less and less about plans and complications. The ranch was modest, but well-maintained, with a small house surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. It spoke of a man who took pride in his work and valued the simple things in life. "It's not much," Jake said, suddenly seeming uncertain as he watched her take in her surroundings. "But it's home. It's perfect," Isabella said honestly, and she meant it. There was something peaceful about this place, something that made her want to stay and forget about the dangerous game she'd been playing for so long. Jake led her to the porch, where they sat on the wooden steps and looked out at the star-filled sky. The desert night was surprisingly cool, and when Isabella shivered slightly, Jake didn't hesitate to wrap his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer to his warmth. "Tell me something real," Jake said quietly, his lips close to her ear. "Something that's just yours, that you've never told anyone else." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, fighting an internal battle between self-preservation and the overwhelming desire to trust this man who'd somehow managed to slip past all her defenses in the span of a single evening. "I used to paint," she said finally, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "Before everything went wrong, I wanted to be an artist. I had this dream of traveling the world, capturing beautiful moments on canvas." Jake's arm tightened around her, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her side. "What happened to that dream?" he asked gently. "Life," Isabella said simply, but there was a world of pain in that single word. Sometimes we have to give up the things we love to protect the people we love even more. Jake turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "Maybe it's time to start taking some of those dreams back," he said softly. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable. It started gentle, almost hesitant, as if they were both afraid of the fire they were about to unleash. But the moment their lips met, all restraint was lost. Isabella's hands fisted in Jake's shirt, pulling him closer as he deepened the kiss, his fingers tangling in her dark hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other as they tried to regain some semblance of control. "This is dangerous," Isabella whispered. But even as she said the words, her hands were still clutching his shirt, unwilling to let him go. "The best things usually are," Jake replied, his voice rough with desire. "Question is, are you brave enough to see where this leads?" Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing her own desire and fear reflected back at her, and made a decision that would change everything. "Show me," she whispered. And Jake's answering smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. What followed was a night of passion and discovery that neither would ever forget. Jake was true to his word, taking his time to show Isabella exactly what love could feel like when it was real and honest and all-consuming. He worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, his hands and lips mapping every inch of her skin as if he were trying to memorize her. Isabella had known desire before, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of what she felt with Jake. He made her feel beautiful and cherished and completely alive in a way she'd never experienced. When she cried out his name in the darkness of his bedroom, it was with a passion that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Afterward, They lay tangled together in his bed, her head on his chest, as he traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The moonlight streaming through the window painted everything in silver, making the moment feel almost dreamlike. "I have to tell you something," Isabella said quietly, her voice cutting through the peaceful silence. She could feel Jake's body tense beneath her, and she knew he was preparing himself for whatever revelation was coming. "I'm listening," he said simply, his hand never stopping its gentle caress of her skin. Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say could change everything between them. "The man I'm looking for, he's not just someone who owes me something. He's my brother, and he's in trouble. Bad trouble." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "What kind of trouble?" he asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. "The kind that gets people killed," Isabella said, lifting her head to look at him. "He got involved with some very dangerous men, and now they're after him. I'm the only family he has left, Jake. I can't just abandon him." Jake's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "Then we'll find him," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We?" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper, afraid to hope that he really meant what he was saying. "You think I'm going to let you face this alone?" Jake asked, his eyes serious. "I told you I wasn't afraid of getting burned, Isabella. I meant it." The relief that flooded through Isabella was so intense, it was almost painful. She'd been carrying this burden alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer to share the load. "It's dangerous," she warned, even as her heart soared at his words. "These men, they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way." "Then it's a good thing I'm not planning on getting in their way," Jake said, with a grin that was equal parts charming and dangerous. "I'm planning on going right through them." The next morning brought new challenges and revelations. Over breakfast, Isabella told Jake everything she knew about her brother's situation. Thomas Rosewood had been working as a bank clerk in San Francisco when he discovered that his employer was laundering money for a notorious gang of outlaws. When he'd tried to do the right thing and report it to the authorities, he'd discovered that the corruption went much deeper than he'd imagined. "He managed to get evidence," Isabella explained, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "Documents that could bring down not just the gang, but several prominent businessmen and even some law enforcement officials. But before he could turn it over to the federal marshals, someone tipped off the gang." Jake's jaw tightened as he listened to her story. He'd seen enough corruption in his time to know how dangerous a situation like this could be. "So he ran," he said, and it wasn't a question. Isabella nodded. "He sent me a telegram saying he was heading to Dusty Ridge, that he had a plan to expose everything safely. But that was 3 weeks ago, and I haven't heard from him since." 3 weeks is a long time in a situation like this," Jake said grimly. "If these men are as dangerous as you say, they could have already." "No," Isabella said firmly, cutting him off. "He's alive. I would know if he wasn't. We've always had this connection, ever since we were children. I can feel that he's still out there, still fighting." Jake reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Then we'll find him," he said with quiet conviction. "But we're going to need help. This isn't the kind of thing two people can handle alone, no matter how determined they are." Isabella's eyes filled with hope for the first time in weeks. "You really mean it? You'll help me?" "Isabella," Jake said, his voice serious, "last night changed everything for me. I don't know what this thing between us is or where it's going, but I know I'm not willing to lose you. If helping your brother is what it takes to keep you safe, then that's what we're going to do." The emotion in his voice made Isabella's heart skip a beat. She'd been so focused on her mission that she hadn't allowed herself to think about what might happen after she found Thomas. But looking at Jake now, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she began to imagine a future that included more than just survival. Their planning was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip as he moved to the window, his body tense and alert. 3 riders, he said quietly, his voice taking on the hard edge of a man who'd lived by his gun for too many years. And they're not here for a social call. Isabella joined him at the window, her blood running cold as she recognized the lead rider. Marcus Kane was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence that stretched from California to Texas. If he was here, it meant the gang had tracked her to Dusty Ridge. "That's Kane," she whispered, her face pale. "He's the gang's enforcer. If he's here, it means they know I'm looking for Thomas." Jake's expression hardened, and Isabella could see the gunslinger he'd once been emerging from behind the peaceful rancher facade. "Stay inside," he ordered, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "And if things go bad, there's a rifle in the bedroom closet and a horse saddled in the back corral." "Jake, no," Isabella grabbed his arm, fear making her voice sharp. "You don't understand what kind of man Kane is. He's killed dozens of people, and he enjoys it." Jake's smile was cold and dangerous, and for a moment, Isabella caught a glimpse of the man he'd been before he'd found peace on this ranch. "Then he's about to meet someone who's killed even more," he said quietly, "and who's got a lot more to lose." The confrontation on the porch was tense and charged with violence. Kane and his men dismounted slowly, their hands resting casually on their weapons as they approached the house. Jake stepped out to meet them, his own hand hovering near his gun, every muscle in his body coiled and ready for action. "Morning, gentlemen," Jake said conversationally, as if he were greeting neighbors instead of dangerous outlaws. "You're on private property. State your business or move along." Kane's smile was cold and predatory. "We're looking for a woman," he said, his voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of education and refinement, corrupted by years of violence. "Pretty little thing. Dark hair, goes by the name of Isabella Rosewood. You wouldn't happen to have seen her, would you?" "Can't say that I have," Jake replied easily. But Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders. "Like I said, you're trespassing. Time to go." Kane's laugh was like broken glass. Now, friend. No need to be unfriendly. We know she's here. Her horse is in your corral, and frankly, you don't look like the type to entertain lady visitors without the whole town knowing about it." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Isabella held her breath as she watched Jake's face darken. She knew he was calculating odds, weighing options, preparing for the violence that seemed inevitable. "Here's how this is going to work," Kane continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You're going to bring the lady out here, nice and peaceful-like, and we're going to have a little conversation with her. Do that, and maybe you get to keep breathing. Refuse, and well," he shrugged eloquently, his hand moving closer to his gun. Jake's response was swift and decisive. His gun was in his hand and firing before Kane had finished speaking. The bullet taking one of the outlaws in the shoulder and spinning him around. The other 2 men scrambled for cover as Jake dove behind a water trough, bullets splintering the wood around him. The gunfight was brief but intense. Jake's years of experience showed as he moved with deadly precision, using the ranch's layout to his advantage. Cain was good, Isabella had to admit, but Jake was better. When the smoke cleared, one outlaw was dead, another was wounded and fleeing, and Cain himself was pinned down behind his horse, blood seeping from a graze on his arm. "This isn't over, Morrison," Cain shouted as he mounted his horse, his face twisted with rage and pain. "We know who you are now, and we know she's here. We'll be back, and next time we'll bring more men." "I'll be waiting," Jake called back, his voice carrying a promise of violence that made even Cain hesitate for a moment before spurring his horse into a gallop. As the dust settled, Isabella ran to Jake, her hands shaking as she checked him for injuries. "Are you hurt?" she asked frantically, her fingers running over his arms and chest, looking for blood. "I'm fine," Jake assured her, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight. But Cain was right about one thing. They'll be back, and they'll bring more men. We can't stay here. Isabella pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. "This is all my fault," she said, her voice breaking. "I should never have involved you in this. I should have known they'd track me here." Jake cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Hey," he said firmly. "Look at me, Isabella. This isn't your fault. You're trying to save your brother, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. We're in this together now, remember?" The love and determination in his voice made Isabella's heart swell with emotion she'd never experienced before. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I know it's crazy, and I know we've only known each other for one night, but I love you, Jake Morrison." Jake's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Good," he said, leaning down to kiss her softly. "Because I love you too, Isabella Rosewood, and I'm not about to let anyone take you away from me." Their moment of tenderness was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching. But this time, Jake relaxed as he recognized the riders. Sheriff Tom Bradley and two of his deputies were riding hard toward the ranch, drawn by the sound of gunfire. "Jake," the sheriff called out as he dismounted. "We heard shooting. Everyone all right?" Jake quickly explained the situation, leaving out some of the more sensitive details about Isabella's mission. Sheriff Bradley was a good man, but Jake wasn't sure how far the corruption Isabella had mentioned might extend. "Marcus Cain, you say?" Bradley's face was grim. "We've been tracking him and his gang for weeks. They hit a bank in Silver Creek last month, killed 2 people. If he's here in Dusty Ridge, it means they're planning something big." Isabella and Jake exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. If Cain was planning something in Dusty Ridge, it probably had to do with Thomas and the evidence he'd gathered. "Sheriff," Isabella said carefully, "I think there might be more to this than just a bank robbery." Cain mentioned looking for someone specific. What if they're here for a reason that has nothing to do with robbing banks? Bradley studied her face, his experienced lawman's instincts picking up on the undercurrents in her voice. "You know something about this, miss?" Isabella took a deep breath, making a decision that could either save her brother or get them all killed. "My name is Isabella Rosewood, and I think my brother might be in your town. He's in possession of some very dangerous information, and Cain's gang will do anything to get it back." The sheriff's expression grew more serious as Isabella told him an abbreviated version of Thomas's story. When she finished, Bradley was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. "If what you're saying is true," he said finally, "then your brother is in more danger than you know. Cain's not the only one looking for him. We've had federal marshals asking questions, and there are rumors that some very powerful men want this evidence buried permanently." Jake's jaw tightened. How powerful are we talking about, Tom? Powerful enough to make people disappear, Bradley said grimly. Powerful enough to buy judges and politicians. If your brother really has evidence that could bring down this kind of operation, then he's not just fighting outlaws. He's fighting the system itself. The weight of the sheriff's words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Isabella had known the situation was dangerous, but she was beginning to realize just how deep the corruption went. "We have to find him," she said desperately, "before they do." "We will," Jake said firmly, his hand finding hers and squeezing tight. "But we're going to need a plan, and we're going to need allies we can trust." Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. "I might know someone who can help," he said. "There's a federal marshal named Sarah Chen who's been investigating this gang for months. She's clean, as far as I can tell, and she's got resources we don't." "Can you contact her?" Isabella asked, hope flickering in her chest. "Already on it," Bradley replied. "But in the meantime, you two need to lay low. Kane will be back, probably with reinforcements. Jake, you can't stay at the ranch. It's too exposed." Jake nodded, his mind already working on alternatives. "There's an old line shack up in the hills," he said. "It's defensible, and there's only one way in or out. We could hold up there until the marshal arrives." "Good thinking," Bradley agreed. "Take supplies for at least a week. And Jake?" The sheriff's voice grew serious. "Watch your back. Kane's got a long memory and a short temper. He won't forget what happened here today." As they prepared to leave the ranch, Isabella couldn't help but feel like she was saying goodbye to something precious. In the space of one night, this place had become more than just a refuge. It had become a symbol of the life she might have with Jake, if they could survive the next few days. "We'll come back," Jake said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "When this is all over, we'll come back and build something real here, something that belongs to us." Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The future Jake was describing seemed almost too good to be true, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. The ride to the line shack was tense and watchful. Jake led them through hidden trails and rocky terrain that would be difficult for Kane's men to follow. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made her heart race with fear. The line shack was exactly what Jake had promised. Small, defensible, and isolated. It sat on a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the surrounding terrain, making it nearly impossible for anyone to approach without being seen. Inside, it was sparse but functional, with supplies that could last them several days if necessary. "Now we wait," Jake said, settling down near the window with his rifle across his knees, "and hope that Marshal Chen gets here before Kane figures out where we've gone." Isabella sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sun set over the desert. Despite the danger they were in, she felt safer than she had in weeks. There was something about Jake's presence that made her believe everything would work out, that they would find Thomas and expose the corruption that had torn her family apart. "Tell me about your brother," Jake said quietly, his arm tightening around her. "What's he like?" Isabella smiled, thinking of Thomas's gentle nature and unwavering moral compass. "He's the best man I know," she said softly. "Always trying to do the right thing, even when it costs him. When our parents died, he could have put me in an orphanage and made his own way in the world. Instead, he worked 3 jobs to keep us together, made sure I had everything I needed." "Sounds like a good man," Jake observed. "The kind worth fighting for." "He is," Isabella agreed. and he'd do the same for me if our positions were reversed. That's just who he is. They talked through the night, sharing stories and dreams, building the foundation of something that felt permanent and real, despite the temporary nature of their situation. Jake told her about his plans for the ranch, about the horses he wanted to breed, and the life he wanted to build. Isabella spoke of her abandoned dreams of painting, and Jake made her promise that when this was all over, she would pick up a brush again. "I want to paint you," she said impulsively, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Just like this, with the moonlight on your face and that look in your eyes." "What look?" Jake asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "The look that says you'd fight the whole world to keep me safe," Isabella replied, her voice soft with emotion. Jake's response was a kiss that spoke of promises and forever, of a love that had ignited fast but burned true. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to regain some control. "When this is over," Jake said quietly, "I want to marry you, Isabella Rosewood. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life." Isabella's heart soared at his words, even as a part of her wondered if they would live long enough to see that future. "Yes," she whispered, because in that moment, with Jake's arms around her and his love surrounding her like armor, anything seemed possible. The next morning brought Marshal Sarah Chen and 2 of her deputies, along with news that changed everything. Chen was a small, efficient woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately inspired confidence. "We found your brother," she said without preamble, after Jake had confirmed her identity. "He's alive, but he's in federal custody. We've been protecting him while we built our case against the gang." Isabella's relief was so intense, she nearly collapsed. "He's safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For now," Chen replied. "But we need that evidence he gathered. Our case is strong, but without those documents, we can't guarantee convictions for the higher-ups. Too many of them have lawyers and connections that could get them off on technicalities." "Where is he?" Isabella demanded. "I want to see him." Chen hesitated. "That's complicated. He's in a safe house about 50 miles from here, but Kane's gang has been sniffing around. We think they might have a lead on his location." Jake's expression hardened. "Then we need to move him, tonight." "Agreed," Chen said, "but we're going to need help. Kane's got at least a dozen men now, maybe more, and some of them are very good at what they do." "What do you need from us?" Isabella asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Chen smiled grimly. "Your brother says you're the only person he trusts completely. He won't turn over the evidence to anyone else, not even us. Says he needs to see you first, needs to know you're safe." Isabella nodded, understanding Thomas's caution. After everything they'd been through, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford to give lightly. "There's something else," Chen continued. "We have reason to believe Kane's planning to hit the safe house tomorrow night. If we're going to move your brother, it has to be tonight." The plan they developed was risky, but necessary. Jake and Isabella would approach the safe house from the south, using their knowledge of the terrain to avoid Kane's scouts. Meanwhile, Chen and her deputies would create a diversion to the north, drawing any watchers away from the real extraction route. "If this goes wrong," Chen warned, "you'll be on your own until we can regroup. Are you sure you want to do this?" Isabella looked at Jake, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "We're sure," she said firmly. "Thomas is my brother. I'm not leaving him to face this alone. The ride to the safe house was tense and dangerous. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. Jake's experience as a former gunslinger showed as he guided them through paths that seemed impossible to navigate, always staying one step ahead of the patrols they occasionally glimpsed in the distance. When they finally reached the safe house, a small cabin hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard for miles. But the reunion with Thomas was everything she'd hoped for and more. Her brother was thinner than she remembered, his face showing the strain of weeks in hiding, but his eyes lit up with joy and relief when he saw her. "Bella," he said, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to use. "I was so worried about you." "I'm fine," Isabella assured him, holding him tight. "But we need to go. Kane's men are close and it's not safe here." Thomas nodded, his expression growing serious. "I have the evidence," he said, patting a leather satchel that never left his side. "Everything we need to bring down the whole operation. But Bella, you need to know, it's worse than we thought. The corruption goes all the way to Washington." Jake's jaw tightened at this news. "How much worse?" he asked grimly. "Senators, federal judges, even some people in the Treasury Department," Thomas replied. "This gang isn't just robbing banks and laundering money. They're part of a network that's been stealing from the government for years." The implications of Thomas's words hit them all like a physical blow. If the corruption really went that high, then even federal protection might not be enough to keep them safe. "All the more reason to get this evidence to the right people," Chen said firmly. "People we know we can trust." The extraction went smoothly at first. They moved through the darkness like a well-oiled machine, Thomas staying close to Isabella, while Jake and Chen's deputies provided security. But as they reached the rendezvous point, where horses were waiting, everything went wrong. Kane and his men emerged from the shadows like demons, surrounding them before anyone could react. The outlaw leader's face was twisted with rage and satisfaction as he realized he finally had them trapped. "Well, well," Kane said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "The whole family, together at last. How touching." Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Kane's men already had their weapons drawn and aimed. "I wouldn't," Kane advised. "Not unless you want to see how many holes we can put in the lovely Miss Rosewood before you clear leather." Isabella stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What do you want, Kane?" Kane's smile was cold and predatory. "I think you know exactly what I want, darling. Your brother has something that belongs to my employers, and they're very eager to get it back." "The evidence doesn't belong to anyone," Thomas said firmly, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at him. "It belongs to the people who deserve to know the truth about what you've been doing." Kane's laugh was like breaking glass. "The truth? The truth is that powerful men do what they want, and little people like you get crushed when you try to stand in their way. Now, hand over that satchel, and maybe I'll make this quick." "No," Isabella said firmly, stepping between Kane and her brother. "You want that evidence? You'll have to go through me first." Kane's expression grew even colder. "That can be arranged," he said, his hand moving to his gun. But before he could draw, Jake moved. His gun was in his hand and firing before anyone could react, the bullet taking Kane in the shoulder and spinning him around. The clearing erupted in gunfire as Chen's deputies opened up from their concealed positions, catching Kane's men in a deadly crossfire. The battle was fierce but brief. When the smoke cleared, Cain was wounded but alive. Several of his men were dead, and the rest had fled into the darkness. Thomas still clutched his satchel, the precious evidence intact. "It's over," Chen said, breathing hard as she surveyed the scene. "We've got Cain, and with his testimony and your evidence, we can bring down the whole network." But Isabella knew it wasn't really over. Men like Cain had allies and resources that went far beyond what they'd seen tonight. The fight for justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Isabella stood on the porch of Jake's ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The trials were over. The corrupt officials were in prison, and Cain's gang had been scattered to the winds. Thomas had been given a new identity and a job with the federal government, his courage and integrity finally recognized and rewarded. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jake said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Isabella replied, leaning into his warmth. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now, Jake prompted, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Now, I have everything I ever dreamed of," Isabella said softly. "A home, a family, someone who loves me for who I am." Jake turned her in his arms, his eyes serious as he looked down at her. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, though his smile took any sting out of the words. "Are you saying you're happy with your choice to marry a simple rancher?" Isabella's laugh was pure joy. "Simple?" she teased, reaching up to trace the scar along his jawline. "There's nothing simple about you, Jake Morrison. You're the most complex, fascinating, wonderful man I've ever known." Their kiss was soft and sweet, full of the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. When they broke apart, Isabella rested her head against Jake's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she whispered, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. "I love you too," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had been dangerous and painful, full of uncertainty and fear. But it had also been the greatest adventure of her life, leading her to a love that burned brighter than any fire and a happiness that felt too good to be true. "Your lips are too hot," she said suddenly, remembering the words that had started it all. Jake's grin was wicked and full of promise. "Then let's see how long before they burn us both," he replied, echoing his words from that first night in the saloon. But this time, Isabella wasn't afraid of the fire. She welcomed it, embraced it, let it consume her completely. Because she'd learned that some fires didn't destroy, they transformed, creating something beautiful and new from the ashes of what came before. And as Jake carried her inside their home, their laughter echoing across the desert night, Isabella knew that this fire would burn forever, warming them through all the years to come.